and welcome. We are pleased to have you all here today, both online and in person at the McLean County Museum of History. We're very excited to have our very own librarian of 20 years, Bill Kemp, local history extraordinaire. This program is being live streamed thanks to the support from WGLT, Bloomington-Normal's public media, a part of the NPR network. Just so everyone knows, it is being live streamed. So when Bill opens it up for questions and comments at the end, I will run around a microphone so that everybody watching at home can hear your questions and engage in the dialogue. So without further ado, Bill Kemp.
Thank you, Michaela. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, we've got about 35 minutes. I've timed myself. I usually go long, so I'm trying to be on my best behavior here. People are often surprised that Bloomington-Normal boasted a street railway network or system, had a company. But that is not unusual given the size, even though Bloomington is a small to medium-sized city connected to Normal. Most communities of this size in the late 19th and into the 20th century would have had a streetcar network of a similar scale to that of the Twin Cities. Bloomington-Normal streetcar system begins in 1867, 2 years after the Civil War, and it will end during the Great Depression in 1936. We are lucky to have this wonderful history book, The History of Street Railways in Bloomington-Normal, Illinois. The title says it all. Self-published back in 1999, hard to believe that's 24 years ago, by the authors, 25 years ago, by the authors and siblings, Fred and Mary Rosem. I'm sure some of you knew Mary. She was an assistant professor of education at Illinois State University, long time a teacher connected with Metcalf School on the campus, retired in 1988 and then was connected during her retirement years to Crossroads, among many things. But she worked with her brother Fred, who at that time was living in Arizona, to put together a quite remarkable history for being a so-called amateur project, right? There are excellent sections on the convoluted financing of public transportation in this era and the deep labor troubles that the Bloomington-Normal Railway faced. This is a certificate we have in our climate-controlled archives, not too far from where I'm speaking here, across from the rotunda here at the museum. Visualizer shown there in this engraving for the stock certificate for the Bloomington and Normal Horse Railway Company is kind of incongruently a steam-powered streetcar. Steam-powered cars were known as dummies, right? So here we have a steam-powered car illustrating, in theory, a horse railway, yet in its earliest years, the local railway made use of cars propelled both by steam, as we see here, and those pulled by flesh and blood horsepower, though in the case of the Twin Cities it was normally mule power. This is courtesy of Fred and Mary Rosem's history. Might be hard to see here, but I've highlighted in red the first line, which opens in 1867. That initial 2-mile line connected downtown Bloomington with the Normal University, today Illinois State University, and the town's business district, rebranded a decade or two ago as Uptown Normal. If you can follow the pointer here, it's going to cross the Chicago and Alton Railroad main line. We know that today as Union Pacific and Amtrak at Franklin Avenue, right? Today Franklin Avenue stops at the Union Pacific and Amtrak main line right there. But it used to pass at one time the streetcar at grade or over the tracks. It's hard for us today to appreciate the difficulty of travel, right? Not only between towns, but actually within communities, right? And the land between Bloomington-Normal was often quite difficult to traverse, right? You had to cross two tributaries of Sugar Creek, or the main branch, in fact, was one of them. So the area was low-lying, it was often wet and muddy, sparsely habited. So the streetcar proved incredibly important for the citizens of both communities to commute. The Bloomington and Normal Horse Railway Company marked the first official run with a September 6, 1867 VIP excursion. The pantograph, which was around at that time, took the occasion to call for the unimpeded operation of steam dummies on city streets, which were quite controversial. The pantograph declares, quote, "Dummies won't hurt anything. If it was possible, Bloomington would have been killed long ago." Why the opposition to steam dummies? Well, they were loud, they produced soot, they had burning embers which could land on shake or cedar roofs and start house fires, right? The Bloomington City Council, in fact, barred steam dummies from running south of the streetcar barns. So the streetcars were housed in a complex of barns or stables, if you will, on the eastern edge of the Illinois Wesleyan campus. That would be the Minor Myers Welcoming Center today. So south of the car barns, steam dummies were not allowed to move, right? Despite the anti-dummy sentiment before the year's end, the railway schedule had grown to 42 trips a day, 21 running each way, so north-south, 21 starting in what we now know as Uptown Normal and 21 in downtown Bloomington, with the first leaving at 7:35 a.m. and the last at 9 p.m. Dummy service or steam-powered streetcars will end locally in 1872. This image, the last drawn horse car in Bloomington, right, shows a old Bloomington-Normal streetcar. There are precious few, if any, photographs of the early streetcar era, but here we have an early car suffering the indignity that a lot of streetcars that had become obsolete suffered, which is being burned for scrap. And here the scene is the railway's car barn on the eastern edge of the Illinois Wesleyan campus sometime in the 1890s. And there's an enlargement of the previous photograph. But of course, the Bloomington-Normal Horse Railway network expanded right from that original line. And I'm showing here in red 3 extensions from the first half of the 1880s, right? Because the purpose of the streetcar clearly was to move people about. Workers to jobs, shoppers to shops, right? And things of that nature. So the West Chestnut Street extension is completed in 1883. That was a lively commercial district in the northwest side of Bloomington. The East Front extension is completed the following year in 1884. That connects the streetcar system basically to the Illinois Central Railroad depot. Illinois Central Railroad today is, of course, Constitution Trail, the rail bed. The depot would have been approximately where Beer Nuts is today. And then the following year, 1885, the West Washington Street line is completed, and that reaches what's known as the Union Depot, the Chicago and Alton Railroad Station, one of the busiest places in McLean County for much of the 20th century. So the streetcar system by the mid-1880s had connected to the major railroad depots in the community, because it was a society that moved by rail, right? This is an 1889 ad from the Bloomington-Normal City Directory for Loudon Machine Works. Robert Loudon, right, had a machine shop. Note the off-kilter scale when it came to depicting the street traffic. The streetcar and the horse-drawn wagon are shown basically in miniature almost, right? And why would that be, right? Because Robert Loudon is pumping up his business and his building, right? And to do that, right, he has to kind of downplay the streetscape in front of him. So it's a relatively accurate representation, but again, the scale is off somewhat. Okay? By 1889, the time of this advertisement, the railway system had 5 miles of trackage, 19 horse cars, and 90 mules. This is all well and good, but we can't forget the drivers and the other employees of the railway. Streetcar driver David Law, writing in 1889, the same year as this illustration, had this to say about working for the Bloomington-Normal Horse Railway Company. Quote, "It is a rather hard life. On this line, we have to start out from the stables at 7:10 in the morning and work until 10:30 at night, with only 20 minutes for dinner and 20 minutes for supper, as we have to work also Sundays, as well as Mondays." By mentioning Sundays and Mondays, he's saying there are no days off. And this is David Law continuing, quote, "But 2 months ago, a lot of us drivers made an arrangement whereby every 10 drivers would pay the wages of an extra driver, so that now every one of us takes a day off every 10 days. So they used their own wages so they could get a day off every 10 days, right? Good old days indeed. There's an enlargement. In 1888, Car 3 that ran between Bloomington and Normal received a hard coal heater known as a Baker heater. Why am I mentioning that? Because that was the first heated streetcar put into service locally, 1888. If you could imagine that, knowing the winters we have here and the prairie winds. For the unheated streetcars to keep warm, they would have straw piled on the floor so you could kind of scoot it around you and at least keep your feet warm. In 1887, 1888, an Eastern syndicate headed by Pennsylvanian John J. Patterson purchased the railway. John J. Patterson, this Pennsylvanian, just a fascinating character, a lecture unto himself, but we just don't have the time here. Patterson and his Eastern financiers set about to what? Electrify the Bloomington-Normal Railway, which up to that point, other than that experiment with steam dummies, those streetcars have been pulled by either horses or mostly mules. So in 1890, the company purchased its first electric cars from the St. Louis Car Company. Hence, I'm showing an advertisement here. The transition, though, from mule power to electric power was anything but smooth, thanks in no small measure to the decision, the ill-fated decision, to go with a system designed and sold by the Leo Daft Company of New Jersey, D-A-F-T, Leo Daft. The many problems in this system included the fact that the 220 volts of electricity it generated proved woefully insufficient, and the cars were perennially or always underpowered. The small four-wheeled electric cars were loud, to say the least. I don't pretend to be a historian of public transportation or electrified streetcars, but I always had the sense that these were kind of beautiful little quiet things moving around neighborhoods, but at least the early electric cars were anything but. It was said, quote, "The car made as nearly as much noise as a sawmill." A reminiscence by Fred Beckman, an electrician who worked for the railroad, reads as thus, quote, "In those days, the noise of a streetcar was so great that loafers at a saloon on the square could tell the second a streetcar got underway at the Union Depot." That's 10 blocks to the west of us. This reminiscence is talking about people at a saloon on the courthouse, now Museum Square. They could hear the screaming friction of her axles as she picked up speed, and they could trace her passage by her danging and her clanging and her squalling brakes. By the early fall of 1890, the electric experiment was put on hold. Electric cars would return the following year, but for a while anyways, most of the railway's cars would still be pulled by mules. This is a whimsical illustration and text that appeared in the first yearbook or annual of Illinois State Normal University, 18 1892, a trip to Bloomington, and students who really depended on the streetcar system to get to downtown Bloomington for jobs they might have, to see a show at night, to attend a lecture, to maybe imbibe a little bit, right? To do things like that. They needed the streetcar system, but it was always on the fritz, right? So students always complained about the streetcar system, and here they do it in a humorous way. Somebody takes a round trip to Bloomington and back, starts out as a young man, a student, comes back an old man, right? And the text reads in part, "We arrived at the streetcar barns in time to go into winter quarters. In the following May, we continued our journey towards the courthouse square, but soon collided with a car drawn by ex-Revolutionary War mules. That accident, of course, led to further delays. Yet things were getting better slowly, because by the fall of 1892, when this index will come out, or it had just come out, the street railway had installed 500-volt dynamos in the powerhouse and adopted Westinghouse apparatus, which proved far superior to the underpowered and unreliable Daft system." Here's a playful map of the campus area and what we now call Uptown Normal in the following ISNU index of 1893, the annual, right? And I've highlighted in red the electric railway as it ran through down North Street, across North Street, through the campus, and then heading toward Bloomington. And I will enlarge this image. And they're referring to the electric railway as the electric snail way right here. Note that. You can also see a tributary or slough of Sugar Creek that no longer exists. It was converted into a brick-lined sewer, right? So much of our hydrology, our surface kind of activity with natural flowing water has been changed with development, including that little tributary right there. Note also that the streetcar crosses the main line of the Chicago and Alton Railroad at grade, right? That would be the crossing at Franklin Avenue that doesn't exist. This index, 1893 ISNU annual, also included another whimsical illustration of an overcrowded streetcar, right? And I can read from here, actual statistics, seating capacity 30, average number of passengers per trip, 143. Number of cars running per day, 2, except when one or both are broken, which is half the time. Here's an absolutely lovely photograph, an early electric car, not long after the adoption of the Westinghouse system that I just made. This is one of the railway's first open electric cars. In the latter half of the 1890s, annual operating expenses totaled something like $22,000. I'm going to adjust for inflation in a second. While income ran as high as $60,000 annually. If you adjust that for inflation in today's dollars, that'd be about $1.5 million. They're earning, right, annually, right? So this was a moneymaker, but the problem was Eastern financiers, capital syndicates, right, were using Midwestern streetcar systems to pull out capital, right? And the investment, the return, just wasn't enough or as much as it should have been, right? So these were money-making propositions, and then you would get out and let somebody else play that game. So ownership, perennially neglected infrastructure improvements, and upkeep. In the spring of 1898, the railway was sold in foreclosure to a local syndicate. So in this period, you'll have local ownership headed by Bloomington attorney A.E. DeMange. And the following month brought the organization of the Bloomington-Normal Railway Company with 11 miles of trackage and 30 streetcars. A.E. DeMange was no stranger to the business because he had been the attorney during the Patterson years, during the years of the Eastern Syndicate. This is a map from the Rosam's book, right? During the A.E. DeMange era, we see the expansion, the web-like rail lines emanating from downtown Bloomington, because as I mentioned, the purpose of a street railway is to move people about. But it's also about what? making a buck on the sly, real estate speculation, insider information, right? Knowing where an extension will go so you can develop real estate along that line because that real estate property values will be increasing. So plenty of games were played. Those in power, right, always made out as the case may be. But despite all of that, right, the railway locally did prove effective in spurring residential development. If you look at Old Northwest Bloomington, the city's east side, what's known as Old North-Normal, the residential area north of the ISU campus, all owe to some part their growth and success to the street railway network. We're enlarging this map, but looking at the south end, and I've highlighted baseball field and Houghton's Lake with the dates of 1902 because the local street railway network will reach these two pleasure grounds, if you will, in 1902 because street railways would often link to ballparks and fairgrounds, Chautauquas, and the like. Because why? Because it was an excellent way to boost ridership, and often the railways had a financial stake, even ownership in these pleasure grounds, though that wasn't the case locally. Here's Fans Field. It was located behind what is today the National Guard Armory. So there are Bloomington Public Recs Department softball fields here, R.T. Dunn fields. But the Bloomington Bloomers played there, Bloomington's minor league club that played in the Illinois-Indiana-Iowa League from 1901 to 1939. The McLean County 4-H Fair was held here from 1935 into the 1950s. The streetcar also went out to Houghton's Lake in Bloomington. State Farm Insurance will purchase this lake and surrounding property in 1948, and it has remained State Farm Park ever since then. This car 42 of the Bloomington-Normal Railway, does not show up in the Rosem book, Fred and Mary Rosem's book. In the back of that book, like any good railroad history, there's a roster, right? An engine or car roster. The number that the company issues to the car or engine, the type of car, the maker model, if you will, right? The maker of that car or locomotive, the years in service, all that information. This car does not appear on that. Very interesting. But we know because the caption on the back reads, motorman on right is Walter B. Razor. He was listed in the city directory as a motorman only 1 year in 1904. Thus, we've attached that circa date. It was in 1903 that the streetcar company, under A.E. DeMange's leadership, purchased 2 local utilities to become the Bloomington-Normal Railway Electric and Heating Company, right? So streetcar companies, right, you needed a power plant, you needed to burn coal to generate steam, to power generators, right, to create electricity, to get things moving. So streetcar networks and systems businesses realized, well, we can get into the electric light business as well and the heating business. So you're beginning to see that occur, right? So the head of the local street railway, as Mike Matika, who's sitting here today, likes to say, this is a house built on nickels, right? Because for much of the 19th and 20th century, the fare was a nickel, right? Nickel meant something at one time, and you could build a palatial residence based on nickels. This is Kemp Hall today on the eastern edge of the Illinois Wesleyan University campus on Main Street. Here's a lovely view around 1905. Around the time of this colorized postcard, the railway operated 16 miles of trackage and 25 streetcars. In 1906, Republican congressman from the Champaign-Urbana area, his name was William B. McKinley, not the president William McKinley, but William B. McKinley, a Republican congressman from Illinois. He will acquire the Bloomington-Normal Railway via a New York brokerage house. He needs some significant capital because the selling price will be $1 million in cash, adjusted for inflation. That's about $33 million today. So the Bloomington-Normal Street Railway in 1906 was worth $33 million in cash. And this entrepreneur, politically connected congressman, purchases this street railway, as he is doing throughout the Midwest and throughout Illinois. He's creating kind of this network of streetcar companies and utilities. We know that today as Illinois Power or Ameren, right? This is the beginning of that. Car 80, constructed by the Danville Car Company. It was known as a pay car, pay as you enter. There was a drop fare box, as you would drop your fare in a box as you would pass the motorman. That doesn't seem that revolutionary to us, but it was at the time because it eliminated the need for a second employee, right? So pay cars were a revolution in public transportation. See just a little extension right there. Here's where you get into real estate speculation and wealth, right? Because that was a little extension to what was called the fairgrounds. There was a series of basically horse tracks in this community at one time, and one was located about on the eastern edge of the Founders Grove neighborhood along Mercer Avenue, right? And as I mentioned, land development and street railways, those two things are inextricably linked. So I'm going to borrow from Greg Koos's research and what he calls Silk Stocking Row. That's a stretch of East Washington Street that owes its existence to a significant part to the street railway, right? Most of these homes, or a lot of these homes, the architect is Arthur L. Pillsbury from Bloomington. Note the home right here, 1325 East Washington, a lovely arts and crafts home. It was built for Dr. J.D. Cunningham, an osteopath. So note that home, and we can see that home in this image. There it is right there with its distinctive 4/1 window sash. So there's a streetcar trundling down East Washington Street, right? There is a photograph of the car barn on the eastern edge of the Illinois Wesleyan University campus and a deactivated powerhouse. As I mentioned, that's about where the Illinois Wesleyan University Minor Myers Welcome Center is located. By the time of this photograph, as I said, the powerhouse was deactivated. The powerhouse for the streetcar network was down where the warehouse district is. And just show a few enlargements from that same photograph. We have tickets from the streetcar railway in our collection. Here we see tickets from two eras. One from probably the late 1890s, dated to William Hart Patterson. He was John J. Patterson's son, while the other one is McKinley, who we know took control in 1906. Lovely colorized postcard of a streetcar trundling down North Street in uptown Normal. So the Normal Theater, though it hasn't been built yet, would be to the right. J.L. Hasbrook, an editor of the Pantograph, mused that the streetcar represented, quote, one of the common levelers of community life. Because we have to remember, before the automobile, residents from all walks of life rubbed shoulders on crowded streetcars in Bloomington and other communities as well. The streetcar was a public space common to the 19th and early 20th century life. Bank managers, department store clerks, college students, factory hands, housewives, all rode the cars. There's the Normal Loop. The ISU campus is right here, the quad, what we know as the quad today, the Normal Loop, right? Operation there began in 1902. So the growth of the beautiful residential area north of the campus, as I mentioned, owes its existence partly to the streetcar network. And we also see here, by this time, the streetcar is running under the Chicago and Alton Main Line. A subway or underpass had been constructed. Here's just a fabulous aerial photograph, undated, of the ISU campus. There's Old Main. This would be looking north, right? This is McCormick Gymnasium. This would be the football field. This is all developed quad now. This would be the complex of the fine arts campus, part of the campus. I've in yellow outlined the rail, the streetcar line, which clipped, right, the southeast corner of what's now the ISU quad. And here we see the construction of an underpass, so the streetcar can get safely under and not dangerously cross the main line of the Chicago and Alton. As we wrap up here, there's a lovely photograph of the subway from a Normal Improvement Association booklet published in 1912. And there's a relatively contemporary photograph with a photograph from that 1912 photograph. More than one sharp-eyed Normalite is puzzled over this narrow, sharply angled underpass, which is just northeast of the 4-lane one built in the early 1970s and the one everybody uses, right? But now you know the secret, right? This was built for the Bloomington-Normal Railway Company. By 1912, earnings were more than $400,000. That's $12 million today, adjusted for inflation. And in 1912, ridership topped 4.3 million. 4.3 million riders in 1912. Bloomington-Normal's population at the time was only 30,000. So that could give you a sense of how important public transportation was prior to the automobile, right? There's a scene of the loading platform, which would just be, right, not just too far from us, on the east side of the Museum Square. In 1925, the street railway operated 8 lines. Service on those lines began at 6 in the morning, ended near midnight. There were 22 cars, and the cash fare in 1923, 7 cents. There's an enlargement. We do not have time, because we're wrapping up, to take but the briefest of looks at the bitter and wild 1917 strike of streetcar employees who are attempting to unionize. Mike Matika, who's here in the front row, gives wonderful programs, including a lot of wonderful detail on this strike. This is a flyer we have of the strike held in our archives. It was enclosed in a letter dated June 10th, 1917, from an Illinois Wesleyan University student, Fred Green, to his parents in Macon County. So he was just writing back to his parents, an Illinois Wesleyan student, but he enclosed this flyer. The letter reads in part, "All the finals are over except zoology tomorrow morning at 7:45. On the whole, they were easier than I thought they would be. The Union streetcar men were out in full force," the student is telling his parents, "trying to get the people to ride in taxis instead of streetcars." And the flyer reads in part, "The Union streetcar men are on strike for the same right that other working men in Bloomington have, the right to organize." The bitter strike came to a head on July 5th, 1917, with a visit by national labor leader Mary Mother Jones, who was then, I think, 79 years old, who delivered a fiery call to arms. Much unrest then ensues as the streets of downtown Bloomington and the warehouse district become basically open combat zones, but luckily nobody is killed, but a lot of property damage and injuries. The next day, July 6th, some 1,400 Illinois militiamen from Peoria and Chicago arrive ostensibly to restore order. Most of them in camp on the courthouse lawn as a show of force. But with the arrival of the National Guardsmen, 1,000 or more workers at the Chicago and Alton railroad shops on the west side of Bloomington, the largest employer in the city at the time, in a show of support for the striking streetcar motormen, set down their tools and marched to and then around the courthouse square, what we call the Museum Square, right? Encircling right where we are, right? As a warning to McKinley, the owner of the streetcar system. If you don't settle this strike, things are going to get ugly, or the strike will ripple outward, right? So McKinley and the street railway companies soon agree to unionize. the workforce or agree to a unionized workforce, assent to a small wage increase and a reduction in the workday, and most interestingly, I think, the union local organized back then, more than 100 years ago, still represents Connect Transit bus drivers today. It's the same local. So I call this photo the end of the line, December 1936. So as we know, in the 1910s and the 1920s and the rise of the automobile, right, that will lead to the all but inevitable, in many ways, decline in ridership, right? The automobile ruins everything, just as the internet is ruining everything. I'm joking. In the fall of 1936, Bloomington-Normal City Lines purchased the street railway franchise and begins to do what? Quickly converting to an all-bus system. Pictured here is car 112 making its way down North Street in uptown Normal. It's in desperate need of a fresh coat of orange paint, that's for sure. But with the scheduled end of all street railway service just days away, there was no need for such niceties. You don't need to look your best when you're headed to the scrapyard. So 2 weeks after the last hurrah, a City of Bloomington work crew began removing the network of copper wire above the now abandoned tracks along West Chestnut, East Walnut, North Main, in the heart of downtown Bloomington. That's what we see here and elsewhere. The wire, if you're interested, was cut into 3.5-foot lengths and then sold for scrap. There's an enlargement. And we'll end with this. There we see streetcar employees being trained to become bus drivers. Mike Matika's father, that's the story of Mike Matika's father, right? Mike? Yeah. So I'll end with this. A street railway schedule from 1925 included a warning to automobile owners. Their high maintenance costs and general unreliability made them a bad choice. Stick with the streetcar. This schedule also included a light-hearted poem, which I'm going to read. Don't worry, it's only 4 lines. You're going to hear the word jack, right? That's a slang term for money, okay? Jack being money. And it goes like this. He who rides horses is riding for show. He who rides autos is spending his dough. He on the bicycle strengthens his back, and those in the streetcar are saving their jack. Thank you. So I think with Michaela's help, we'll open it up to questions or comments if anybody has anything.
Please raise your hand, and I'll bring the mic to you. Questions, comments?
Mike, you want to add anything here? Okay. Peg, did you have something, Peg? No? Okay.
Yeah. The picture of Mother Jones had 1910 and 1915. Why?
If I can remember correctly, I don't think that the photo's dated, so they're trying to estimate the rough date of the photo.
Oh.
Does that sound?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Anyone else?
If I could just say one more thing, what I didn't have time for is to talk about the interurban system too, because in addition to an electrified street railway in Bloomington-Normal that people could make use of, from 1906, right, Mike, until 1953, Bloomington was connected to what was first called the Illinois Traction System, later the Illinois Terminal Railroad, and that was I would call it light rail, though that's technically not correct, but it was an interurban or traction system. So this was an electrified rail system that connected Bloomington to where? You could head west to Peoria to shop for the afternoon and then to come back. You could also head down to Decatur, and from Decatur, head east to Champaign-Urbana and Danville. So there was an interurban or electrified rail network connecting Bloomington and many central Illinois communities. And then from Mackinac, if you're heading to Peoria, from Mackinac you can go down to Springfield, and from Springfield to St. Louis. So it was one of the more comprehensive interurban or traction systems in the country and one of the longest running, and Bloomington was connected to that, and the interurban also came through downtown. But it was separate from the streetcar system. So there was at one time two modes of transportation involving electric rail.
I might add to that McKinley, who owned the local traction system, owned the interurban, and he owned over 60 different street railways and railroad companies that were all electrified across Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. And out of that grew Illinois Power and Light. So as they're generating power for the streetcars, they're then starting to sell it off. And a court case in 1947 says you cannot own you have to separate these businesses. So Illinois Power and Light was spun off, and then the Illinois Terminal Railroad became its own separate entity. But that whole electric grid grew out of these electric transportation systems.
Help me now. Broadway Avenue in Normal, I was told that's an avenue separately because that's where the street railway
Yeah, Broadway never had a streetcar line, so.
Oh.
Yes, but Franklin Avenue, which is less tonier, not as historic in many ways, that was where the streetcar line was. So the boulevard at Franklin Avenue from Broman Medical Center to all the way to the tracks was the original main line, and that green space in between, that's where the streetcar line was. Yeah, but not Clinton or Broadway. Yeah.
When I was a child growing up in Peru, my father worked for Illinois Power, and he had a lunch break, and he would often come home and say, well, today I had lunch at the Interurban Cafe. The term interurban meant absolutely nothing to me. I knew where it was, but I didn't know why. Was that one connected with Bloomington at all?
No. Yeah.
It was owned by the same system, but it ran from Joliet along the Illinois River Valley, and the hope was, the McKinley scheme was to connect it from the Illinois River Valley to Peoria and then make a Chicago to St. Louis system, and instead spent their money to build a new underground subway terminal in St. Louis as the Depression began. And so by that time the cash was gone and that system faded. Within a year or two, that line was abandoned. It was kind of an orphan, but all under the same ownership.
Any other questions, comments? All right, well, why don't we give Bill another round of applause? Thank you. Our Lunch and Learn series is an ongoing series. They're always streamed live on our YouTube channel and in person. Our next Lunch and Learn will be on February 8th. We'll be hosting Ben Rossett, who is a local game designer, and Jamie Mathy, owner of Red Raccoons, and they'll be talking about all things board games. After that, we will welcome back Greg Coos in March to talk about Irish immigration. And after that, we have a workshop on planning your own sensory garden with a U of I extension educator. So more information on all of those events can be found at mchistory.org, and we hope to see you again. Thank you. Have a good day.